Good evening, fellow cryptosophers. Tonight we've got a really special episode coming at you. So, in lieu of our normal book podcasts and specialist series, tonight Max and I are going to engage in a few disagreements. You may have noticed over the course of our videos leading up to this that Max and I seem to agree a lot, and yet we come from radically different backgrounds and actually have radically different viewpoints of the world. I myself kind of fall in the conservative, traditionalist, Catholic camp, and Max, on the other hand, is a pseudo-libertarian, agnostic, left-leaning fellow. So the fact that much of our dialogue consists of agreements is pretty counter, or is at least counterintuitive to the fact of our personalities and our own intellectual and political dispositions. So tonight we've got lined up about 10 topics upon which Max and I disagree. Who knows if we'll end up getting to all 10, knowing how loquacious the two of us seem to be for most of the time. But we're excited to get into this, and we're hoping that through these disagreements that we can tease out a little bit of his hidden wisdom.
Yeah, I'm very excited, and also I want to say that depends which left you're talking about.
Yeah, well, the only left that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, the libertarian left.
Yeah.
Maybe. I'm becoming a political agnostic.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, let's hop right in.
Yeah, let's hop right in. Okay, so the first disagreement we've titled just the value and reach of the scientific method. So I was figuring we could do this. I don't want to overly structure it, but maybe you say a few words, I say a few words, and then we just get into kind of a cross-examination.
Yeah, that sounds good. I don't know how eloquently I'm going to be able to elaborate on the scientific method, but I think the most basic summary that I could give is that it's a game where you get points for proving yourself wrong, you get points for proving other people wrong, and there's no orthodoxy. Everything is built on first principles that scale from physics to chemistry to biology. And then within the experiments in a field, you scale from proving something very small to proving something very large. And it's an attempt to get the prejudices that human beings naturally have, and our intuitions and our inability to statistically calculate well, and a variety of other biases that come with the human cognitive tool set. It's an attempt to get those out of the way and to isolate variables. And I would say in that way, the reach of science is potentially limitless, though we don't know when we're going to run up against a wall with computing power. But at the same time, it is in no way certain. And I think we get into a big problem with people debating science when people start taking the results of scientific studies far too seriously, when in truth, the sample sizes, the populations, the hypotheses all need refinement. And so I do think the reach of science is far, far beyond where we've gotten. And I think this was the original thing that Bacon in The New Atlantis and Descartes in the Discourse on Method were seeing when they saw that our evolutionarily adapted mind wasn't able to get at nature, and we required experimentation and detachment and peer review, although they didn't put it that way, in order to understand the cosmos. I think that might be a good start.
Great. So I'm going to summarize my positions that are more or less not necessarily arguing that the scientific method is useless, but I think that I would be of the opinion that it's far more bracketed or bounded in its usefulness. And the reasons for there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is insofar as the scientific method, right, which the general structure, as most people know, is the positing of a hypothesis, conducting an experiment that is capable of refuting or supporting your hypothesis, and then analyzing the data from your experiment and seeing whether or not you can draw a true or false conclusion of your hypothesis. And I think that in its method, the scientific method, because it limits the scope of what true and false means to the realm of data, which are experiential, right? There has to be an observer for any data, even insofar as it attempts to restrict human biases. There's a fundamental bias that the scientific method cannot overcome, and that's ultimately that the scientific method is a method which yields truth, right? Science cannot answer whether or not science leads to truth. And so I think that that's a meta scientific problem that oftentimes doesn't enter into the debate, mostly because the scientific method appears to be limitless in scope when in fact it's just put a little bit of a curtain on top of the larger problem in which the scientific method is embedded in. Secondly, and definitely stemming from that, I think that the scientific method, frankly, doesn't take enough into account. I think insofar as it's restricted to material and efficient causes, there's no room for formal and final causality in science. And again, that's a dispositional and a prejudicial position that the scientific method takes against other avenues of truth. And those other avenues, you might say, would be the experiential or the literary or the poetic, which I would say are equally, if not sometimes more valid than the scientific method.
I don't know if that second one is an argument against materialism per se. Would you categorize it that way?
I would say that it is an argument against materialism, right? Because ultimately, materialism at its fundamental core is the thought. I mean, and maybe not fundamentally, but contained therein is a claim that the universe is made up of material causes and efficient causes. And
Okay.
again, there's a meta scientific question there that asks, well, is the universe really just made up of material and efficient causality? So, I mean, ultimately, I think this leads to my third and final point and that's that the scientific method seems to elevate the experimenter or the scientist to a position in the cosmos that, in all frankness, is not consistent with its status, simply because the world in which we are embedded is, uncomprehensibly complex. And to limit the ability to weed through that complexity to one method, I think is foolish, especially when you stack up the fact that social revolutions, just differences in viewpoint that are mostly literary in their character, have accounted for way more change, at least maybe in terms of quantity, throughout the history of the human race than the scientific project, right? Ultimately, I would say that there has been a major revolution as a result of the proliferation of the scientific method. I mean, the best example of this is technology. But many of the things that were promised from the revolution of technological expansion, such as more information equals more choice equals more freedom. I think that's one that has fundamentally not come true. But I would argue that position is consistent with at least the supposition behind a scientific method, and even in that case, if it applies itself to that question, it would ultimately be found wanting, right? You can conduct an experiment to figure out whether or not the proliferation of technology has led to an increase of democracy. And in some cases, that's true, or at least it appeared to be true, especially in the Arab Spring. But then in the years that followed, it became quite clear that it didn't matter.
Yeah, I think one maybe good way to bracket the disagreement would be to start with the argument that the reason that science is such a powerful method isn't because of necessarily the method itself or the hypothesis testing or the probabilistic conclusions, but it would be in its working repeatedly. And I think that is something that is a different empirical defense of science, but leads its scope to be much larger. And I think when we try to bracket science into something, you go to physics, for instance, and you get airplanes and the engineering of buildings, which are getting taller and taller, and the engineering of rockets and cars and other technologies. When we apply this method to the physics or the chemistry of things, the results are quite robust. Now, when we scale that to psychology or biology or evolutionary theory, given the complexity of nature, we don't get that same result. I think that doesn't preclude that the scientific method can't one day solve many of the more complex systems problems. But I think the mere fact that we've extended life in the way we have, that we've extended safety in the way we have, that planes fly and land hundreds of thousands, if not millions, every day, it shows that we understand something about the nature of the world. And this something was only possible with the scientific method. But I think you got to sort of separate the disciplines to talk about where science can't reach and where it has. And I think insofar as you want to talk about physics or chemistry, that is to say, what we're able to do given our understanding of the way that these either chemicals or the physics of things work, that the scientific method is extremely robust in those instances. But the question then becomes, in the more complex disciplines, how far can it go? And I think that's probably where we disagree.
Indeed. I think, but another place where we might disagree is whether or not the advances that the scientific method has objectively brought act as evidence for the truth claims that it says that they will, right? Because ultimately, I would make the argument, and I think that it's probably pretty standard, and you mentioned it earlier, that the scientific method can be derived in part back to Descartes. And one of the interesting things about Descartes is that he has to go to really extreme lengths for us to imagine a material world that's apart from form or final cause, purpose, right? So ultimately, he develops a system whereby we can intuit that matter is, by its very nature, something that's meaningless. It's just extension moving about in space. And therefore, it becomes the provenance of human beings to apply will to that matter to make things that are both pleasurable and useful for the human being. So the question then becomes, right, because this is the ethical question in which science itself is embedded, whether or not the sheer application of the human will against the material universe is something that's good, right? So this is the conundrum of what you might call, environmentalists in the present day and age, who, for the most part, are as atheistic and materialistic as they come, and yet they're making these arguments that place ethical boundaries on industry and engineering and science for the sake of something more important than the physical or the material things of which industry, engineering, and science is using to propagate those things that are both desirable and pleasurable for human beings, right? So the question is, firstly, can science answer that question on its own, or does science need some kind of ethic that stands before it and informs it? And two, is it in fact true? I mean, or a more fundamental question is it in fact true that the material universe is nothing but extended matter in motion, right? There's a strong case to be made that Descartes, went to the extreme dualism that he did of mind and extended body for the sake of casting the extended body as being something without form. But at the same time, what he actually does too, and very intentionally, is asserts that there is no mind either. There is no such thing as human nature. So then even the human being becomes subject to the same sort of extensibility that the material universe comes up against. And I think that is this like the sort of the source or the root of post-humanism or transhumanism, which again all brings us back to the question of where does where does the scientific method's ability to yield truth butt up against an ethic, and where does the scientific method's ability to create useful and pleasurable things butt up against that same ethic? And I would be willing to grant the position that it's probably a lot further. It's a lot more bounded than perhaps other people would think. Right? There are arguments to be made that even such things as air conditioning, let alone social media or email, are actually good, objectively speaking, for human nature. Now, interestingly, that argument then starts to become embedded within another ultimately scientific claim, right? Especially if you're arguing from a standpoint of evolutionary biology. Right, there's an argument to be made that the technology of farming is bad for humans because all of a sudden we're eating a carbohydrate-rich diet that we didn't evolve to be able to consume, and that's one of the reasons that we have such bad dental health in the last 10,000 years or so. And that just makes the question, even more problematic. What if ethics is forced to act in the sphere of science? In some ways, it's restricting itself. While in that first example of why carbohydrate-rich diets, ultimately why farming might be bad for us, had to do with our dental health. That's a scientific argument. That's in kind of in the realm of evolutionary biology. But then you ask the question, well, how many less people starved as a result of the development of farming techniques, for example? And then again, that's you're bracketing yourself into another scientific claim, but then contained within that is the thought that human life is more valuable when it's not starving, for example. So ultimately, I think the question is a very difficult one. And the fact that I'm still able to continue to rattle off on this singular point is evidence to how complex the problem would be. And so I think the solution ultimately is to come in with a hard stop at some point. I'm not saying that I know where that point is, but to come in with a hard stop and say, no, science does not yield or have universal access to truth. And it doesn't for the primary reason that it cannot prove that its own method is one that yields truth. That is an assumption. And then two, there are some other fundamental ethical claims that have to be made that ultimately, for me, derive from the Judeo-Christian tradition, and basically every ethics board in science today is actually just an instantiation of Judeo-Christian morality. And that needs to, that again is a fundamental kind of cultural assumption that there are certain things that science can't do, and that I think that those boundaries need to be made as firm as possible.
Yeah, there's a ton there. I think on the second question, maybe we could push it back to metaethics if we want to talk about metaethics. But I think that at this point, I tend to be genuinely agnostic to the relationship between ethics and science. Though I do like some of the more consequentialist theories that locate ethics in conscious creatures and their ability to flourish and suffer. Whether that's a reliable ground or not, I don't know. And it doesn't seem robust enough to me to give a full ethical account that would constrain us in the right way, at the very least. But I'm not so sure that we disagree. I just think that Yeah, because I mean, I guess the main point of our disagreement would be, where does science stop and something like philosophy begin, or where does science stop and literature and story begin? Um, and I don't know where we're drawing that line differently. Do I think that science can answer the most important questions in human life? I genuinely don't. However, do I think that it's the most robust method by which to establish theory, not truth? I do. And I think that's especially true because the most, like, if you want to become the most famous scientist, it would be to destroy the current theory, to come up with a different explanation of a current theory. And we saw that with Einstein. Um, but I think our regardless of the relationship between um, ethics and science, presupposing that we have an ethic that makes it run, um, I think our disagreement rests in where it stops and where other methods of investigation begin.
Do you think that a useful question or line of reasoning might help us elucidate this disagreement a bit more, whether or not it matters um, that the Trojan War, as depicted in the Iliad, actually took place?
Do I think that matters to the scientific method?
Well, do we think that that question, right? So, I mean, obviously, we could make the argument that there's truths to be derived from the Iliad, even if it is not historically true that those events took place. Do you think that that's a useful kind of uh, case study of this, where to put science stopping and literature beginning, for example?
Yeah, I think it could be. I guess, I mean, I really see why you're driving at the ethical issue now. It depends why we care about what we're looking for, too.
Right.
I mean, to the extent that we already presuppose a kind of ethic that, say, you can derive truths from literature, or uh, we could even take the utilitarian standpoint there and say you can derive ways of thinking about stories and action and characters, and maybe narrative in such a way that increases the net well-being of your life or the pleasure in your life. So, like, literature could be utilitarian in that way. So I really do get why you were driving at the ethical question, and I think that the way in which the scientific debate gets confused is when um, people take science as a kind of ideology in itself, which it's not supposed to be. Though you are right in saying that Descartes' original formulation was presupposing an ethic that in some way, that we should figure out a way to make the thinking thing exist through time as both healthier and perhaps even able to avoid death. And I think that would be, I mean, the main disagreement might be in specific areas where I would apply the scientific method where you wouldn't, but lacking in like a shared ethic, which maybe we do share. I think it would be the specific instances in which different truth-seeking methods are applied, rather than this method or that method for these universal cases. And that might be too relative too.
Maybe a good example of this. So I had a conversation with another friend of mine at one point where we were talking about we were kind of talking about the ideals of education, and I more or less kind of just threw out the claim that studying Latin and Greek makes people smarter, and his question to me was, well, where's your data that backs that up? Has an experiment been done that correlates the study of Latin and Greek with IQ? And I'm like, no, I don't actually need to go find that data, because I look at all of the smart people literally for the last, from more or less from the year 750 BC through 1960. Every single like smart person knew either Latin, Greek, or both, and that was the evidence or the data that I would cite in my favor. But that's ultimately one that's a historical um, kind of supposition based upon the tradition that's been handed on to me
Mhm.
from those people rather than an actual surveillance of all of the smart people in the last 2,700 years.
I mean, my opinion on that would be depending on how you're defining smarter. If it is a measure of IQ, then we know that I don't know how well this has been studied. I do know some features of learning a foreign language, how they do affect the brain. I think that's very interesting. But I guess it would just depend on what you mean by smarter.
Right.
Um, yeah, because I tend not to take a broad IQ approach either. I think as far as, I mean, there's at least two things there that would seem to be true. One is the ability to understand our history and its development, um, so as to better understand the present context. And the second would be the ability to derive like etymologies, the roots of words, and understand more concrete meanings that way, but also just the ability to linguistically change the way that you reason about something because the formulation and structure of the sentences is different. And those might be valuable tools in that way too. I mean, am I being too much of a scientist about it?
No, I mean, I think that's exactly the point that I was trying to drive upon, and I think that that's the heart of the disagreement, right? Is the general manner of the approach is different. I would look at something from a historical perspective, but it's like the history as it's been handed on to the present rather than the actual history is what contains the truth. And I think that that's ultimately because I mean, sort of like science, and I think science actually gets this from philosophy, is that there's a sort of historically iterative um, quality to present truths, right? It's a trial and error over thousands of years that yields the traditions that we have today, right? So I would be willing to put my stake in the ground that traditions that have been handed on to the present day that even today might seem useless, and you could perhaps even do a scientific study to demonstrate that. I would be that experiment would not yield a truth claim fundamentally, or yeah, I mean it would be wrong according to my analysis of the situation. So like, let's take a concrete example. I'm trying to think of something that's kind of a human universal that's just been handed on and refined over time.
We can talk about monogamy,
Yeah, monogamy. Or
though people argue that that's biological.
indeed. Um,
Um, yeah, um, I'm lost on an example.
yeah, same. Well, anyway, the point is I would say that those traditions handed on to us. I mean, I can think of more recent ones, right? Like voting, like the institution of voting, right, is ancient and has been changed, over the course of thousands of years, and then gets dramatically changed in more or less the late 1700s, right, giving us the great democracies of the modern era. But still, something like the institution of voting comes to us, and yet I'm pretty sure that there's some scientific studies that have been done that show that the overall happiness of people in democratic countries during election years goes down, right? So, uh, which would kind of be an evidence that maybe this institution of voting, whether it's instantiated in like a democracy or in something more monarchist or feudalist, is not something that's ultimately quote unquote good. And we can kind of demonstrate that using the scientific method, and yet we keep it around. And that would be, in my opinion, an evidence for a meta scientific truth, like a truth that exists beyond what science would tell us.
Yeah, I guess our disagreement there would only be that I think that you have the intuition that science can never get at that question, and I have the intuition that our tools, methods, and techniques are just insufficient at this point in human history to get at those. But I mean, I don't really think we disagree in the sense of, I mean, for instance, that study had to have been self-report, which is already problematic.
Right.
Um, and now we're talking about, complex historical systems, which there are too many confounding and other variables to really make it what's called a quote hard science. So I think that was what I said in one of our opening volleys, right? Um, whether or not science will take over these territories, the historical, the traditional, the institutional, and to what extent, I think is sort of up to the one who created the cosmos, or the cosmos itself, and the limits of the techniques we can develop. But I think as far as the hard sciences, which I guess I would say is physics, chemistry, and biology, I think that the method has shown incredible reach, scope, and accuracy. But I don't think that trespasses in any way on tradition, beauty, spirituality, and so on. And I think that people who think that or say that science does that are really missing just how skeptical the method and the conclusions are.
Do you believe that science can answer why questions?
At least one form of them. So that the usual linguistic separation in why questions is how come and what for. So in the what for sense, we might be able to, using certain tools in psychology, like why is this agent or this set of agents acting, or like what for are they acting out of? They all seem to be saying that they're doing this, but is there something else going on there? But I think science is really robust in the how come form of why. What initial conditions led to this outcome?
Hmm. Yeah, I think ultimately, you've used this distinction between two kinds of why questions, what for and how come, before with me, and I think that ultimately, I kind of want to restrict it back to the soul usage. I mean, if you ask, why is it that hydrogen and oxygen, when in the presence of some activation energy, um, come together to form water, for example. I mean, there is no why to that question. That's a description of a process. It's a statement of a fact that when hydrogen and oxygen are together in the presence of activation energy, then
Mm-hmm.
water is produced. It seems to me that fundamental why questions, like why does that reaction happen the way it does, or why do planets orbit in the way they do, even though you might be able to ask them in terms of whys, whenever you're answering them in terms of descriptions, which is to say you're answering a why question with a what, or a how, or some combination thereof. And I think that fundamentally that's why you need something to sit in front of science that supplies those fundamental whys. So why does the Earth orbit the sun? The answer is not gravity, right? The answer might be something like divine providence, right? And that why question exists somewhere out and beyond science's ability to ask and answer those questions. And I would like to see, at least in the popular imagination of what science can do, is some kind of an acknowledgement for that. I think the proliferation of what we might call popular atheism on the backbone of science, the scientific method, facts, quote unquote, and data, is absolutely asinine, because I think most of those people, one, don't know the science that they're talking about, and two, have never actually encountered somebody who could really ask a why question and demonstrate that it can't be proven with science. So I think my problem with the scientific method is not the scientific method, right? I actually believe that there are truths about the material and efficient worlds that need to be brought to the fore, and that the scientific method is a great way of doing that. However, the effect that it's had, at least on a great percentage of, or maybe not a great percentage, but some, insubstantial percentage of people in Western nations in the modern world and in the 21st century, is evidence that I think a little bit more intellectual humility in the way that science is taught would do better for truth itself.
Yeah, and I think this is just, this is a kind of tribalism. To think, or to treat science as a kind of worldview or ideology and identify with it in that way is very anti-science. Like, that is against the whole purpose of the method, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I love the question, do you believe in science?
No one believes in science.
Yet that statement is thrown around so much. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I honestly, even though kind of we have our particular disagreements, I think that fundamentally we agree.
Yeah.
That my main point is that I hate the way in which science is characterized in the popular imagination.
Yeah, I do too. Actually, as someone who has a great deal of love of science and some of the conclusions it's produced, and I don't know, like, I almost have a spiritual relationship with some of the theories we have going right now. It's amazing to contemplate the universe through, say, the Hubble telescope, or the black holes. But yeah, this is going to be frustrating because I feel like we're going to do this for every topic tonight.
Indeed. Do you know a lot about black holes?
No. I've read some things, though. I know that we are so well. The theories that are proposed keep changing.
Yeah.
I think Stephen Hawking, before he died, had proposed a new theory the year before he died.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and we have simulations of no, they're actually observations of the stars moving around the black hole at the center of our galaxy and their motion and like a time lapse. But as to the actual nature of a black hole and what's going on, I think that we are extremely limited at this point, and it's a set of or opposing hypotheses, or that's in relationship to, obviously, space time and the rest of our physics theories. So they have to line up with the previous theory, but there's multiple different interpretations of what a black hole is.
One of the things that I find interesting about the study of black holes is the kind of the universal claim that if we could understand a black hole better, we might understand the Big Bang better, right? Because they seem to be materially similar phenomena, in that both represent a particle of definite mass with an undefined density, right? An infinite density, because it occupies no space. I once had a sort of theory that if we could glimpse inside, the reason that we cannot glimpse inside the event horizon of a black hole is because that would be to view matter and material causes as they are. But insofar as we ourselves are made of matter, we are fundamentally restricted in our ability to understand it because we can only think in terms of matter. Thus we're limited by the particular way in which the matter is arranged in our brains, and thus we can't contemplate matter itself. And so I thought that there was an interesting, at least corollary between the study of black holes and ultimately the fundamental questions.
Yeah, it seems to be, especially because black holes seem to rip through what we call reality or space and time.
Right.
So, I think at least one way of getting into that is the whatever things are made up of. And I think this is a method that's often employed in science. Whatever a phenomena is, a phenomena that breaks through what we call standard or more usual in a system, shows us a lot about what that actual system is. It's sort of like a crash test for a car.
Right. Or the phrase that I love so much, it's the the objection or the the objection that proves the rule. No, that's not right. The
Exception.
exception that proves the rule. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'll just quickly go back to our agreement and then we can move on unless you have other things to say. I think people who are, usually when people are too certain about science, they haven't studied science. But I think that cultural movement is harmful because science isn't an ideology or belief system. It's just an incremental attempt through experiments and methodologies and peer review and so on, hypothesis testing and the establishment of theories to get a grasp on specific kinds of phenomena. You know, you can be a Christian and a scientist, or a Muslim and a scientist, or a nihilist and a scientist. The method precludes ideology in that way. And to make the method itself an ideology is to not be scientifically skeptical enough about it.
Right. Well, I think that actually provides a good segue into a debate that you and I were actually having the other day on the phone, and we never actually got to conclude, and that was whether or not nihilism is a tenable philosophical position.
Yeah. Yeah. I was wondering if you could define that for me again as you see it.
Sure. So I have kind of the fundamental conception that nihilism in its root word means right the doctrine of nothingness or the doctrine of nothing, but as it's kind of, which is an ironic term, right?
I believe in nothing. Okay.
Yeah. Or I love the phrase that comes up in Heidegger classes all too frequently. We need to talk very seriously about nothing. But that's neither here nor there. But I think the problem of nothing is very serious, right? And that's why Heidegger has to talk very seriously about nothing. At the same time, however, I think that any person that I think nihilism is only tenable insofar as you're not there yet and you're trying to avoid it. But I don't know that there is such a thing as a consistent, logically consistent, or maybe logically consistent doctrine that encompasses nihilism, right? Because I would say, the fundamental axiom of nihilism seems to be there is no meaning, nothing really matters anyway. So, F this, right? And the logical conclusion from that is nothing short of massacre and suicide, right? Which is what I would say. Yeah, I mean, that's what happens with school shootings. That's what happens in concentration camps. That's so logically consistent nihilism finds a way of not persisting in the world for very long because it attempts to kill as much as it can and then ultimately kill itself. On the other hand, there's an argument to be made that even that is not real nihilism because insofar as there is no meaning, and I should preface this by saying that I think that there's an inherent claim of meaningfulness in any hierarchy of value. So insofar as I choose to do or say or act in one way versus another, I'm already positing the existence of a value structure. And if that's the case, then I'm not a nihilist anymore.
I would go further than you do. It's not just that it's not logically consistent, like say our current gender pronoun debate. Like I see the theory of that debate, how there's a spectrum and blah blah blah, and we've been given a culture. It's not logically consistent, but I can make sense of it. The thing that I've never understood about nihilism is that it's not just not logically consistent; it's literally senseless. And in that, why are you trying to convince me that there is no meaning with words that I'm understanding? How do you just like you were saying with action? It's like I'm a nihilist, and then I get up and brush my teeth.
Right? Why the hell do that?
Well, clearly not. Clearly, there's a value there, but the meaningful claim that meaning doesn't exist is, I think, nonsense. It's a round square.
On the other hand, this debate that we had the other day was sparked by a question of whether or not there's ultimate meaning or an ultimate purpose in the universe.
Yeah.
And you made that claim, I believe, and that's when I called you a nihilist and then proved why you weren't actually that.
Yeah. Well, I just think that if you get a sufficient, we'll just take the most reductionist materialistic count of what I meant there. If you get a sufficiently evolved complex system with a like a nervous system or a brain that can represent things and has passions and inclinations and so on, then meaning exists because that thing is now taking in a world through its senses, it's moving places and so on. Now whether or not that the meaning of those creatures is ultimate in the universe, we can still have meaning without ultimate meaning. I think even from the most, this universe is an accident, life on this planet's an accident, there's nothing really to this, you can still get a robust account of meaning, I think.
But isn't the
And
logically consistent claim of that since there's meaning for the conscious being, that there must it is necessary that the conscious being with meaning come to exist in the universe?
I'm not sure I understand.
So the question is there ultimate meaning in the universe? Well, what if you locate that ultimate meaning in the conscious being? And you say that the universe has had always meaning because it was always leading towards the advent of the conscious being.
Sure. I mean, that would be to certain materialist types, that would be a post hoc uh, kind of account of the conscious being. But yeah, I think once something matters to someone or meaning exists in one, then as conscious beings, we push meaning into the universe. In other words, things are no longer neutral to us when we are in relation to them.
I read this one philosopher and I got very into him, Kenton Meillassoux, and he had as his first principle really was a principle of unreason, that everything that is in the universe is for no reason whatsoever and could at any moment cease to be or come to be something else, which is the positing of an ultimate sort of um, an ultimate source, like lack of reason, lack of purpose, lack of, in some sense, meaning. And yet what he's able to do from this kind of first principle of unreason, of chaos, is demonstrate that the principle of non-contradiction is an ontological rather than a rational principle. And we see this at the end of book 4 in the middle of book 4 in Aristotle's Metaphysics as well. He doesn't posit non-contradiction as a rational claim, but rather as a metaphysical one. So for Meillassoux, what's interesting is that all of a sudden, for no reason whatsoever, this class of being, the thinking beings, come to be, and they're able to grasp the fundamental principle of the universe, namely chaos or unreason or purposelessness. And insofar as they are beings capable of grasping the meaning, like the meaning of the universe in a really interesting way, lends them a dignity that they deserve, and yet the universe has not granted, which is namely, since they're able to contemplate the reason that gave the fundamental cause of the universe being unreason, that they have a dignity that is worthy of contemplation of that truth for forever. And what's really interesting about Meillassoux is that he seems to kind of embody this sort of meaninglessness in the advent of the human character, and then brings meaning through the back door through humans. And yet, because the advent of human beings was always logically consistent with the system, they were in some sense always a virtual reality of the universe, even though they were never a potential reality.
Uh,
And so I wonder what that viewpoint has to say about this debate on nihilism, because it would seem at the outset to be the most nihilistic of all, and yet, right, it's literally that nothing is for any reason whatsoever and could cease to be for no reason whatsoever, or could come to be something else for no reason whatsoever. Um,
do you agree with that perspective?
I wouldn't say I agree with that perspective, but that thinker Mayasu has been very influential on my own philosophical development. So it's hard for me to sometimes separate what he thinks versus what I think, or what I think of what he's said.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting account that seems to take into consideration many of the more probable scientific theories we have. But I mean, I still don't see any way in which nihilism is a sensible position to hold. Doyle?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Kind of fully there. And yet the ultimate question kind of hinges on what's the relationship between meaning and nihilism. It seems that you're willing to kind of bracket them to two separate domains, whereas I want to force them back together.
Yeah, well, I just think there is clearly something, and we're in relation to something, even if we're confused about everything, as Descartes found out. And I can't find the place of nothing in existence. You can be a nihilist if you could get outside of existence, and then in what sense are you a nihilist?
See, well, that's the interesting thing about nothing that we were kind of broaching on earlier, right? Nothing is significant because it exists over and against what is, right? Insofar as there are things, we are beckoned to ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing at all?
Yeah. And I mean, to a certain extent, I don't even know if I agree with the grammar of that question. Because there could be,
What's your retort that you often say?
well, one of my favorite things to do with people who are having an existential crisis, and I went through this, was people would say, what is the purpose of life? Why am I here? Blah, blah, blah. But I said, your sentence is, or the word you used is missing a plural. And the real question is, what are the purposes of life? Because we perform hundreds of thousands of tasks to ends that we can't even imagine or don't always contemplate, and so on. And so there might not be a singular cause for there being something rather than nothing.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, the interesting thing about that question is that it ultimately, as Heidegger says, fundamentally collapses into asking why the why, and then that is what establishes the human being, the questioner, the philosopher as the kind of most important, the question of who are we, as being of fundamental importance, and having to start there before you can ever attempt to answer that first question, why is there anything rather than nothing. First you must come to grips with a kind of self-knowledge.
Do you know anyone who claims to be a nihilist?
I read a paper by a guy who claims to be a nihilist.
Can we get him on the podcast?
His name is Ray Brassier, and I doubt it. He's one of these speculative realist dudes. He's in the Mayasu kind of movement, and he has this interesting adage: I'm a nihilist because I still believe in truth.
What?
Which is to say, he says something along the lines of conceiving of reality in a non-narrative way does not preclude conceiving of like rationality in a narrative way. Um, but insofar as rationality attempts to apply its narrative structure upon the reality that it contemplates, um, it's trying to square a circle, and therefore you must deny the existence of a narrative structure in reality in order to come to grips with anything like a truth claim. So therefore, he's a nihilist because he still believes in truth,
Uh,
which is interesting. And I like the adage; it's super heterodox, and I'm all about stuff like that. And for a time in my life, I actually embraced that claim. I was writing to a friend recently about this. I at the time I hadn't read the paper in a couple of years, and I was just kind of doing my own thinking. And all of a sudden, that statement sort of came to me in as a conclusion. It's like, well, gosh, I'm a nihilist because I still believe in truth. So I kind of, having read it, was primed by the existence of that claim, and then had reasoned my way into a world where it was true, um, which is perhaps an interesting story. I don't know if you care, but it was ultimately this question going back whether or not the fact of the events of the Iliad happened in history matters, against the truths that are conveyed in the story. And ultimately, the conclusion that I had was, there must be a strict divorce between reality and truth, because even though those events never took place, they're of prime importance in giving an animating spirit to the West, and therefore, the world of truth is supremely higher than the world of facts and material things, and therefore, I associating facts and material things with reality once said that I was a nihilist because I still believed in the truth of literature.
yeah.
But
Yeah, I think we could probably move on from that.
sure.
I know I could bat a couple things back your way, um, but I would be very curious maybe if we read a paper or a book or something on nihilism, if we could flesh this out more, because I still haven't found any account that makes a claim for meaninglessness, or you know that would seem to be the central piece of nihilism, and that seems to be self-contradictory before it gets off the ground.
Indeed. Yeah, and maybe we can come back to that. We'll definitely worth exploring at another time. Okay, let's switch away from theoretical and let's get a little bit more concrete. I want to talk about forms of government, Max.
God.
Because I think we're gonna have a real debate here, because um, I am a firm believer in monarchy and the monarchical system, a very particular kind that I'll outline for you in the course of this discussion. But I think that the mere thought seems, heretical to you. Am I wrong?
I mean, yeah, in general, I think so. Um, and there's two levels to that. There's the ability to impose tyranny, which is, I think, what usually happens in the situation where there's a monarchy historically. But then there's also the um, divisibility of agents working on a problem. And so I think the genius of more democratic or republic-based systems is that um, we're never going to come up with a satisfying answer in policy, in the way we organize ourselves, in the way we organize economics, and so on. But it's this dialectical tension when thousands of people are arguing with each other that produces many more novel solutions than a top-down approach could manage.
Well, the question is ultimately whether or not everybody is worthy of participating in those conversations, right? Because there's certainly room for heated debate, dialogue, voting, even in a monarchy. Um, Yet it's very different from the sort of public-facing one person, one vote. Everybody is capable of making the decisions that are necessary to run a government.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
it's a fundamental claim on equality, right? So, I mean, correct me if I'm speaking into your words, but you would have a fundamental position that from a political perspective, all people are equal. And I would have the counter position that politically speaking, absolutely in no way are all people equal.
I guess it depends on what you mean by equal.
One person, one vote.
Oh, because I think that a republic makes more sense than a democracy in that sense.
Right.
Um, but I don't know. I think I want to be an empiricist about this, but I haven't run enough history through my brain to really be able to say for sure. But I think that in general, more monarchical societies tend towards tyranny and oppression, and more republican societies tend towards liberality and freedom.
I think
And
fundamentally, what I would challenge you on is to expand your historical horizon. So the fundamental kind of monarchy that I subscribe to is what you would call feudal monarchy, right? So there's actually a really kind of robust example of this in the 8th, 9th, 10th into the 11th and 12th centuries in France, right? So I mean that's a good chunk of time. That's several hundred years. That's many hundred years. And they had a system that was very unique, right? It was ultimately that these groups of people made up a nation, Gaines, Gens, and they they were a people with their own laws and their own histories and their own traditions, and then through various historical accidents, they end up um, in various alliances with the peoples around them and near them. In some cases, those people have a king. In some cases, those people have a duke or a count, or some other title. And ultimately, as those alliances expand, you get something of a nation that's more or less based on a fundamental racial identity, right? Germans or French, that um, in which all of those member quote unquote nations elect a king who actually has very small direct control over the land, right? His one job is to ensure that the rights of the nobles are respected, and that in the event that the whole collective is attacked, that he organizes the troops to go launch a counterattack and therefore is due taxes. But his direct control is actually very limited to a state that's normally much smaller than the average duchy, for example. So in that kind of particular system, you have kind of a monarchy, but it's much more like an aristocracy, really. And I think that there is an interesting argument to be made that Republican forms of government take the best of the system I was just describing and the best of democracy and kind of put them together. And I think that's evidenced indeed by what you were saying, by just the general freedom that comes about, or the social good that comes about from Republican forms of government. And I think there is an interesting question whether or not it compares to, say, the overall public good of those that were living in these medieval feudal societies, right? Because ultimately, the peasants, insofar as they lived, I mean, rather meager existences, but beyond that, actually had a pretty good time of it, right? They were actually bound to the land, and so when a feudal lord would come and invade another feudal lord, it behooved him not to kill any of the peasants, or else there wouldn't be anybody to work the land.
how
and
generous.
and well, then the conquest was useless, right? Because why would you invade somewhere were it not for economic or political gain, right? And so as a result, the peasants actually found themselves they weren't conscripted to fight in armies, and they kind of found themselves just tilling their fields while the battles were taking place elsewhere. And then every couple of years they'd be paying their taxes to a different lord, but for the most part actually enjoyed a relative stability versus the other classes, the higher classes, the ruling classes that were actually making the decisions on the day-to-day basis.
What was the fall of the feudal system?
So in France, it's really interesting. It was from this law that was in the Salic laws that said that anything that gets attached to the rights and dignities of the king of France can never be stripped away from him. So even though initially the king of France occupied this small territory kind of in the center of France, and then you had all of these duchies and counties outside and around it that made up the over and a few kingdoms as well that made up the larger kingdom of France over time. As the royal family continued to marry into more and more of these other royal families from these other counties, duchies, and kingdoms, the territory of the King of France continued to expand, and the law said that must always remain in his possession after those rights and privileges had been joined to his. So ultimately, you ended up with a King of France who was also the Duke of Burgundy, who was also the Duke of Aquitaine, who was also the King of Brittany, who was also the Duke of Normandy. Because all of those rights and privileges, even though those nations continued to subsist, their offices more and more became held by one man, and that's ultimately what historically yields us the absolute monarchy of France in the early modern period.
Yeah, I think that was exactly my first argument, is that systems like this always tend towards tyranny.
Well, I think you need to make tyranny and absolutism are not necessarily synonymous.
I think in the historical record, we could probably find some exceptions, but in general, I feel like it is. I
It
hope.
would. I mean, there's definitely the argument to be made that absolutism is the precondition for tyranny, but that doesn't equate the two.
Yeah. Um, I'm going to throw out a very stupid argument on its face, but I hope that it leads to not an argument, a question. Um, why then hasn't a feudal system outperformed, say, something like the United States?
Well, there's an argument to be made that at least initially the United States embodied as much of a feudal system as it could, insofar as you had actual member countries who had all of the rights and privileges and power, and the purpose of the federal government was simply to ensure that the rights of those states was never infringed upon, and it cared for the general well-being of the collective on the whole.
Yeah.
So there's actually an argument to be made that at least as it was envisioned and less is ruled this way, but was envisioned as fundamentally not much different from the feudal system that I was outlining that we had in the Middle Ages in France and Germany.
Yeah, to that extent, I might agree with you. I think sort of from a experiments of democracy standpoint, the ability to have different areas under the same basic axioms, such as the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, allows for experiments in the laws in which strengthen the whole union. So, I mean, a great example of this recently has been Colorado's legalization of weed.
Right.
And now the number of states who are attempting to legalize weed in the next election cycle. The experiment, for the most part, there is a few statistics you could talk about, really worked well. And were weed to become nationally legal, and it would be a terrible idea. People were just getting stoned all the time, and economics were impacted, and general well-being was impacted. That's the problem with a top-down system.
Right.
Insofar as the feudal slash American system represents the ability to experiment with the laws, I think it's extremely beneficial.
Right. Well, this is exactly the phenomenon that allows me to be both a monarchist and an American and a politically engaged one, because I ultimately do see the what we are living in is the trees and branches of the seeds that were sown in the feudal era. right? This constant over the course of hundreds of years, figuring out what kinds of systems work and what systems don't. I think, interestingly, the exact same thing that happened to France in the mid part of the second millennium AD is exactly what's happening now in the United States. And other than, yeah, the exception of state laws on gay marriage initially, but now weed proliferating through the country. More and more, we're seeing a top-down system where the states and their governments are more or less becoming figure governments for ultimately a top-down system. So, what's interesting there is like you thought that with this brilliant idea that they had resurrected from the past, they would have put more protections in place for the states. And I think that, well, there's a number of reasons why states' rights died. Some of them are more sensical than others, but and hell, I mean, I'd be willing to talk about that, given that that's my political kind of my one real political belief about the United States is states' rights. But
Yeah. There's, I mean, I think there's at least one more question here from my point of view, which is if feudalism was more successful or a better system of government than, say, an American style republic, what then were its fruits? Because I think a good measure of a society is its progress and its ability to create culture, art, architecture, and so on. And as far as I'm aware, feudalism didn't make many advances for humanity per se.
oh, see, here's where you're wrong, my friend. Where did the Catholic churches demand that both parties consent to a marriage come? Came from ninth century France, and the work of the Carolingian scholars and bishops and government wrote it into canon law that both the husband and the wife had to consent to the marriage. Like that's a really big deal. And that came directly out of the feudal culture. And that was ultimately an instantiation of the belief that human beings, both man and woman, were created in the image and likeness of God. So that's I think, a prime example. The consent of both the husband and the wife to a marriage. Another example is the establishment of the university. Right, that is the pure product of the medieval ideal of the world.
Although it was a very orthodox university.
See, that's not true either, right? That like in the University of Paris in the Middle Ages, it was like once a semester, two of the best doctors of theology would get up on stage and one would argue for an orthodox position and the other would argue for a heretical position. And the heretic, quote unquote, was encouraged to do everything he could to prove himself right against the orthodox person, because there was this fundamental belief that the truth would never lose, and that orthodoxy was truth, and therefore heresy could have all of its bells and whistles and could be pursued to the nth degree. And if it could come up with any kind of claim, then it was orthodoxy that needed to be revisited.
As a heretic myself, I don't think they were trying hard enough.
Oh no, they were though. Like that's the beautiful thing. It's like the thought of tenure comes like comes into the medieval university system precisely because they wanted to protect professors from the Holy Office and these other bodies that are charged rightfully with maintaining orthodoxy. The universities wanted to ensure that truth was protected at all costs, and so they protected their professors to research whatever topics they wanted to, and that was what tenure was.
This is actually reminding me of the current political correctness debate in the United States and the controversy surrounding universities. Because originally universities, like feudal systems, were ruled by the teachers and professors.
Yeah.
And the administration was really a wing that sort of guaranteed the general operations of, the bigger picture stuff, but didn't have much control over the professors.
Yeah. Well, in the medieval university, there was no administration. It was all of the faculty would take on these administrative positions in between semesters when they weren't teaching.
Even better. And now we see the sort of original democratic um, conception of the university falling into the tyranny of the administration and the diversity committees and the various enforcements that follow on students' freedom of thought and faculty's freedom of thought. So, I mean, I wonder, regardless of whether or not we're able to hash out feudalism versus, I guess, republicanism, whether or not every system that begins without tyranny is doomed to end with it.
I think the answer is yes. I think that precisely insofar as humans are corrupted and fallen, and fundamentally, I toe the Augustinian line here that politics is a just punishment by God for our sinfulness in the Garden of Eden, something that's meant to make us unhappy and present us with an opportunity to provide reparation for our sins. That there, because that's true, the threat of tyranny must always exist because human beings are evil.
I wonder.
Not evil in their essence, but in their fallen nature.
Yeah, I wonder if you could implement um, a policy like a constitutional amendment almost that there may be no law established on the state or federal level that can go on longer than a decade. If that would help correct.
Well, so the question there is, we'll see.
Because
I would make the contrary argument that once a law is enacted, it can never be repealed. Because then we would have to be much more careful with the laws that we enacted.
I mean, although I don't think we would have to be that careful because were a law to work, then the calls for reinstituting that law would be much greater. Like
Indeed.
if suddenly alcohol prohibition was back on the table, there's no way we're trying prohibition again.
Right. But
yeah,
well, I mean, it's an interesting question, right? I mean, the ancient conception of laws, particularly the medieval conception of laws, is that they, even though they are written and changed all the time, they're fundamentally, there are some laws that are just so ancient that they are instantiated in whatever system you're writing laws into. A great example of this is so the city of London is mentioned in the Magna Carta, right, which is one of the first attempts to write down the rights of the nobles, by the way. It's really cool. It's like the rights of the nobles forever had just been the responsibility of the king to enforce, but nobody had ever decided to write them down, right? There was no need to. Everybody knew what the rights of nobles were. And it was only when a particular king was being very egregious in his disrespect for the rights of the nobles that the nobles got together and wrote them all down. But they mention the city of London there in the Magna Carta, and it's this is an ancient document. I don't know the year exactly, but it's a long time ago, and it says the city of London shall be entitled to all of its ancient rights and privileges, and then doesn't say what they are, which is super funny because the whole point of the document is for the nobles to write down their ancient laws and privileges. Yet there still seems to be this fundamental supposition that the rights and privileges need not be written down because everybody knows what they are. And I think this is the beautiful thing about the common law system from which we descended, but ultimately kind of killed in a number of ways in the United States when we could have continued it on in a really cool way. The fundamental axiom of the common law system is that the rights and privileges of human beings are infinite in number and innumerable. And therefore, the only time that you can limit the rights of humans is when they come into conflict with one another. Right? So the very thought of a Bill of Rights in a common law system makes no sense because you can only figure out what the rights and privileges are of human beings or in particular context where those two rights and privileges are superseding one another.
Yeah, although once you get a university derived theory that speech is violence, a Bill of Rights starts to become necessary.
Indeed. Yeah.
I mean,
well,
a
good court system would have been an alleviation to that problem as well.
Yeah. I guess maybe the wrapping up point, so we can get another one or couple debate topics in, is I still don't see why the feudal system is superior to the republican system.
Ultimately, I think it's the question of, I mean, it's a lot easier to answer that question on the grounds of feudalism versus pure democracy. But then we can extrapolate the point that I don't think that, you know, the masses, including myself, are have the right or the privilege or even the duty and responsibility of deciding who gets to make the big decisions. I think that there's an argument to be made that an aristocracy that's predicated both on long traditions, on rights and honors and duties, puts the individual decision maker, embeds with him within a context of adherence to tradition, of adherence to an honor code that now has been replaced simply by the will of the masses. And so I think that any system that elects its leaders will fall into tyranny far more quickly than an aristocratic system like the feudal system. And I think that insofar as that system, kind of robustly worked for almost 1,000 years in the Middle Ages, before breaking down into tyranny of the absolute monarchies of France, um, is interesting. It's like, will American democracy last 1,000 years before it devolves into tyranny? And I would say, from the way that things are going, that absolutely not. So why is feudalism better? Because it slows down the process of degeneration into tyranny.
Hmm. Well, I guess I will. No, I'm not going to remain agnostic. You're certainly wrong, but I'm open to more historical evidence in the point. And moreover, I think that the more experiments we can run in government, the better off we will be as well. So um, maybe if we could try that on a state level, it would be interesting too. With
Hey,
the
I would love that. I would love to see a state have a king, and I would love to see another state attempt to be a communist state, and I would love to see another state attempt to be a pure anarchy or a pure anarcho-capitalist system.
yeah, I
That would
mean,
be awesome.
let's give it a run and see where people vote with their feet, with their wallets. That is the true test of any political system, which is very strange if you think about it. Why people get so upset about their political convictions, um,
Yeah.
just as far as ideology goes. Other than fascism and communism, I'm not willing to write anything off a priori.
Good, good.
So yeah, maybe one day you'll be the king, Doyle.
Someday, that's the long-term goal. King of Indiana.
All right. I'll leave it to you how many more we can cover, but I'm enjoying disagreeing with you.
Yeah, this is fun. Do you want to talk about? Um, I want to talk about the philosophy of language a bit, and so ultimately, I'm going to need you to summarize your position for me, and that will kind of give me a backdrop over in which that I can summarize my own positions on the philosophy of language. But in a nutshell, um, you would argue that words and their meaning are derived from a particular context, and I would say that words and their meanings are derived mostly, if not all, from the tradition out of which those words arise, and ultimately that the fundamental structure of a word conveys something of metaphysical value, which is to say that its meaning is completely outside the context.
Yeah.
But will you go ahead and summarize your position?
I wouldn't make my position so relativistic as to say that it is solely context dependent. Of course, that can't be the case because we can still read, Civil War letters and understand them, even though we don't speak the way that they do, because we speak English. Nonetheless, I think my central claim about language is the claim in Wittgenstein in the philosophical investigations that there is no one thing common to all of language, and therefore, in particular context, given what we demand of meaning in our form of life, and the activities that we're doing, who we're doing with, and so on, that those specifics, given what we demand of language, it becomes useful in that way. So we can get to a classicist etymological language game where we take your consideration of the etymology of roots and so on into it. But we could also get into a different language game like comedy or like even declarative statements or a coach yelling at his players, where the meaning of words is it's dependent on the need that we have for words in that game. So it's not relative. It's not to say that language can't convey truth. It's just to say that there's no one thing common to all of language where we can set a boundary around this is what language is. Because as soon as we do that, we could just invent a language game outside of that boundary that still purveys meaning.
So what about an interesting counterexample of something like a self-referential pronoun?
Zurich?
Right. Oh, that wouldn't be self-referential. That would be referring to a third party.
Is that Z? Like myself, Z self?
Oh, Z. No, I don't think it works that way. It's still myself.
Yeah, it's actually just like a sort of racist French accent. Z self? Anyways, my apologies.
Gosh, yeah, people don't understand how language works when they start inventing pronouns. The simple fact of the matter is that the first person referential pronoun, i.e., me, right? I myself, me. That pronoun is as ancient as written language is. We don't know of an Indo-European language that's been ever written or can be reliably derived through an etymological study where the first person referential pronoun is not the letter M and a vowel that is related to the vowel that makes the E sound.
Yeah, and hence the meditations on first philosophy.
Right.
I think.
Right. I mean, the fact of the matter is that, but my argument is particularly here in, right. You said that, that words are fundamentally not relativistic, but the words that somebody can call to use are in some sense dependent on the context, and there's no one frame that gives us an ability to kind of bracket a word or its meaning. But I would say that pronoun is
not a word in its meaning. All of language.
All of language.
Yeah, there's no boundary you can draw around language. Is the argument.
Can you flesh that out just a bit more for me?
Yeah, sure. So Wittgenstein uses this concept of family resemblances. And I think a good way to describe this is the difference between a hierarchy and a network. So a hierarchy is a top-down imposition where whatever the top node or axiom is defines all of the rest of the nodes. Whereas the family resemblances among language games, the way in which they associate to each other and to our activities and forms of life as human beings, all the forms of language relate to each other in a network, but there's nothing common to all of language. That's the argument. So you can't draw a boundary around all of language and say all functions this way, because we're going to find a language game given human customs or activities or subcultures that manages to convey meaning through words that yet falls outside of that definition.
Well, wouldn't the claim that all language is all words or all languages or something signal meaning? Doesn't that put a bracket around language, which is to say that spoken things that don't correspond to meaning aren't language?
Yeah, although there's sort of like the vocalization of sounds, and maybe I'm forgetting what the music type is. Sort of like the bop bop bada, where you can get an artistic or poetic meaning from something that you can't get a literal truth definition. I mean, so you've got to be careful there, because you could run up against saying that certain kinds of vocal performance convey no meaning, or certain kinds of art convey no meaning, even though they're.
Or it just wouldn't be linguistic meaning.
I mean, but they're using like constructions of linguistic meaning.
Hmm.
And this is the big problem that you run into with. I mean, I spent way too long trying to figure out what I was talking about when I was trying to define language for my thesis, and I could never surmount this problem. It was that language works in its game, in the game that we play with it, but it itself is not, um, what is that, constitutive of one thing. And there are inventions, games, subcultures, and so on that will always trespass across a boundary and yet be communicating meaning.
Hmm.
I don't know if a useful metaphor would be computer code too. Like binary isn't a language, but it produces meaning as far as our technology goes.
Well, I wanted to kind of zero in on the me pronoun thing just for a second because I think it might help us kind of wade into this a bit because that's as close as we can come. I mean, not as close, but it's very close to we can come to something that's universal in its signaling of meaning. And it's ultimately self-referential, which is to say that it's psychological. And insofar as language arises from the psyche, it's almost like the word me is an existential communication of the essence of that person who is speaking. Right. And insofar as we can do that with one word, we can also do it with others, particularly the most ancient ones.
Yeah, I think what you're missing there is women from Japan. It might be guys. I think I'm forgetting, or maybe it's another Asian country, East Asian country that are named me. Um, and then there's different construals of me. I forget if it's a restaurant or a grocery store that contains the name. But if we search through the uses of the word me, there's not just that metaphysical conception of an I. And so whatever it is, it can't be contained in the word because we can use me in so many other situations.
Right. Well, I'm specifically bracketing it to Indo-European use, right? Because I think that there is something to be said for us, an animating spirit of the West.
Yeah. So we
Right.
talked about
So what I don't know what those similar ancient pronouns that fundamentally communicate the Eastern, you know, sense of self or I-ness, and maybe there isn't one insofar, and that's why they're collectivist societies to this day. But like the fact that we've got this individualist society that has this most ancient representation of the self-referential pronoun is precisely my point.
Yeah. Although that's not how the word always means. I mean, it's not contained in the syllables or letters or characters written on a page. It's contained within the use of me in a language game. Yeah, like when a teacher asks who wants a cupcake, and one of the third graders is like, "Oh, me, 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 me."
Yeah.
I don't think that's the same use of the word me as you're talking about.
No, it clearly is. Don't tread on me. And the third grader raising their hand and saying me, 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 me. That's the same.
Not
It,
to the third grader.
yeah, but upon the horizon of analysis, it is like the word literally arises from the psyche of the third grader from this ancient depth that it doesn't yet understand or know.
Even if that were the case, and there are like words that are more robust across their uses in various language games, that's not going to apply for most words. I mean, I don't agree that there's a singular definition of how me is used in sentences. I'm just failing to think of an example right now. But
Oh no, it's the speaker of the sentence making a reference back to itself.
I mean, but then there's also you can come up with situations where that starts to bend. I think you certainly can. Though I would argue that if that is, let's say that's the one robust etymological word, I would challenge you to find another one. If we're not using me with a variety of meanings, we're certainly using beauty and truth and love and every other quote profound or deep word in a way that's used in a variety of ways to convey a variety of meanings in a variety of contexts.
So let's maybe do a little mini case study here. And this is not me not having the answer. So the word sacred
Mhm.
derives from the Latin word sacer, which olderly was sacer, which, if you go back far enough in Proto-Italic, actually means something disgusting or ugly. And yet it comes to mean something holy, because there is something fundamentally in common that the disgusting and the holy have in common, is that they are set apart from their communities. Um, they are held up and outside and above.
Mhm.
Um, so when you think of, so insofar as that is, quote unquote true from an etymological perspective, does that actually give us a more robust way of understanding somebody in English when they're talking about the sacred?
Um, I mean, I guess it would depend on the sentence in which it's used and the person who's saying it and what they're trying to convey. I mean, let me pervert your etymological definition by saying that um, our just to go back a topic too, our common humanity and our Bill of Rights is sacred.
Yeah, ugly and set apart.
But
Something we don't want to touch.
but it,
It's untouchable.
I mean, we could say that, although that we have made amendments to it as well.
Sure, but
That I mean, I think that your approach here is useful. I think
it's
it's
only in a particular context and not universally.
yeah, exactly. I think it's very useful if we want to get into philosophically rigorous definitions or track the maybe historical change in a concept or a value, or even the lack of change. But if we if we invent scenarios where people use words, or even find scenarios when people use words, we'll find that it is not in the word itself that things come to mean anything. It's in that language, game, activity, community, custom,
Yeah,
tradition.
but then why use that word and not some other one?
Because in that context, that's a the most useful word, hypothetically.
So I mean, but that's to say that the 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 word has a root meaning or a set of meanings that I can leverage in a particular context to drive whatever meaning I'm attempting to convey in that particular context using that tool that I have at my disposal. But it's a tool. It actually exists. It has independent existence and meaning from me. I can just use it.
Certainly. But there are games that you currently don't play where that tool can be employed in a way that doesn't match with your meaning in your game.
So I mean, I get the example that you like to use a lot is, you hold up a beer can and then you say this is Peter, and then you say, and then you hand it over to me and you say, hey, that's Peter, and I'm like, okay, whatever, it's a beer can. And then
Yeah,
a couple of minutes later in the conversation, you say to the person, hey, will you hand me Peter? And then everybody laughs and they hand you the beer can,
yeah,
which supposedly proves your point, right?
yeah.
But the
Well,
question
it,
the question
it's
is
a
whether or not
superficial
it does,
example.
right? What?
It's a superficial example.
It is a superficial example, but the fact is, if I use a word like in just an absolutely in a ridiculous way, like what's a this conversation is um
Yellow.
yellow. Yes. Yeah, this conversation is yellow. What you've actually done there is you've taken the tool from your toolbox and you've broken it.
Yeah, although I do want to say that sometimes it's fun to break rules and convey more meaning.
Why isn't this conversation blue, Max?
I don't know. I'm not a postmodernist poet. I can't shatter the sky. Um, but that's what I mean. It's not. I think what you're missing to what I'm saying is not all meanings are equally meaningful across language games.
Hmm.
Like the Peter example represents. If you and I want to create an institution or we're a part of a religious tradition, um, and we want to use a word like sacred, we mean something very specific and profound that has a history, a divinity, and a certain lifestyle attached to it. That doesn't, the conception of language I'm giving, just to be clear, because I think it can sound relativistic and democratic in a perverse way, is that this isn't to presuppose the value of language. It's in a sort of epistemological attempt to almost avoid relativism by accepting it as its own system of conveying meanings. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
Like we can say certain language games are bullshit. We can say certain uses of language are nonsense. That doesn't mean that they don't convey meaning to the participants in that language game. But it could be to say that those meanings aren't true, or those meanings aren't useful, or even that those meanings are perverse, morally speaking. But it's just to admit the complexity of our language and its use, and how many. I mean, the metaphor Wittgenstein uses, which interestingly enough Descartes uses too in the Meditations. I was actually shocked to find that is that our language is like a city, and there's like an old city with mazed roads and all sorts of things that are not well constructed. I mean, not well constructed for navigation. Um, and then there are new suburbs that grow out of language that are much more linear and easy to navigate through. And I think that's the struggle with language is you and I could invent a language game right now where, Peter means beer or whatever we wanted, and we could use it, we could employ it and convey meanings to each other. But
But doesn't it precisely, in some sense, derive its meaning from the fact that it's a heterodox break with the actual meaning of the word?
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say in all cases, but it certainly could be as a general rule.
Hmm.
And that's the thing. I just think people who try to draw, and I think this is the wisdom of Wittgenstein, people who try to draw a wall around language and say this is how it works are not accounting for uh, maybe even the success of human beings, what sets us apart from the other animals per se.
Hmm.
That our language is so fundamentally creative and malleable that it can simultaneously hold Orthodox Islam and postmodern feminism. So I don't know. I don't know. I definitely could be wrong. I really did only study one philosopher here, so I'm open to it. But that is the main defense of my thesis.
Well, I mean, I'm gonna have to admit defeat until I can regroup and bring some more psychological evidence to argue that words erupt out of the psyche.
Yeah, no, I think I'm game for that. Maybe we could have a language podcast.
That would be a good one. I think at this point we definitely didn't get to as many as we wanted, but we did cover the bases, and we've been going on for a good while now. I think this could be a good stopping point for us.
Yeah, whatever you're feeling.
Whatever I'm feeling. See, now I'm overanalyzing the words we're using in these. I'm asking myself, am I using them in a manner that's consistent with their history?
No, certainly.
Certainly not. Well, Max, this conversation has been yellow. I really appreciate it. It's been great. But anyway, just a few housekeeping things regarding the channel in general. I don't know if you have noticed, if you're listening to this on YouTube, you will find on our banner picture, the one that has the Raphael School of Athens, over on the right, you're going to find a series of links. One is to our Telegram, which you can also find at t.me/cryptosophy_community. So that is just a Telegram channel where Max and I are willing to have conversations with anyone really about anything. It's a good channel to delve into some hidden meanings. So if you feel so inclined, if you're a Telegram user, click on that link over there and find yourself in the Cryptosophy community group. You'll also find a link over there to our Anchor podcast website. On Anchor, you'll be able to listen to just the raw audio file. And then I think the last link over there is to our blog. We don't have any content up on the blog yet, but it's a Medium blog. I believe it's medium.com/cryptosophy. So we'll be more or less frequently posting some blog posts and interesting thoughts, just to give our users more ways of interacting with our project of getting hidden wisdom wherever it can be found. Our next podcast will be coming up soon on Aristotle's metaphysics, and we're greatly looking forward to having that conversation on air.
That makes one of us.
That makes one of us. Well,
it is the worst book we've read.
It's tough. I actually really started to get into it by around book 4.
Well, yeah, maybe I need to just keep hustling on it.
But. Yeah, just keep hustling. Like it gets good, I promise. It gets a lot more concrete too. So
yeah, I've never wanted to burn a book so bad.
Well, good. Max, this has been fun. We should do it again sometime. We should have a Disagreements Part 2, and maybe we should get into like some more visceral debates and have less theoretical conversations. But I thought this one was good.
I think so. I think I'm much better at arguing on the visceral level.
Indeed. Awesome. Hey, thanks to all for listening. Feel free to subscribe, like, comment. We're really looking for feedback so we can improve the channel. And ultimately just keep more people in the dialogue. So with that, this has been Doyle and Max with another episode of Cryptosophy. Have a great evening.
Stay yellow.
Stay yellow.